SZA is probably the biggest R&B artist in the world right now. I'm not actually sure if that's true, but the girl is getting tons of publicity at the moment off the back of her new album SOS, and it sure as hell feels like she's the biggest R&B artist in the world. But that's kind of weird to say, given the fact that before her most recent album, SZA hadn't dropped a new project since like 2017, a very long time. And it's not like she was some musical icon before 2017. Control, the album she released that year, was her studio debut. And off the back of basically that project alone, ignoring some EPs, SZA gained a whole cult fan base, which has somehow kept her extremely relevant for the past 5 years of dropping no music outside of like one single and a few features here and there. And this isn't a review of Control, but it's important to mention that album to set the stage for SOS. After all, Control was all we really had to base our expectations of SOS on in the first place. Personally, I love Control. I definitely don't think it's the absolute masterpiece I know a lot of people see it as, for reasons we'll get into deeper into the review, but I think it's an album with a lot of personality, promise, and potential. Some tracks on Control, like Drew Barrymore, Pretty Little Birds, and Doves in the Wind, are some of my all-time favorites, and I really enjoy pretty much everything else on the album, even though there are a few weak spots for me here and there, mostly tied to SZA's singing voice, which can be rough at points, and a kind of repetitiveness inherent in a lot of the songs on Control. Really just minor nitpicks, but still. For me, Control was good enough to make me excited about SZA's future output, but not exactly the type of album that guaranteed that future output would be great. It was very possible that Control was going to be just a flash in the pan. I respect the hell out of cult SZA fans. I know she needed them when TDE held up her musical output, but for a long time, I struggled to see exactly why SZA was so loved. I really enjoyed her features and her music, but I felt like she hadn't yet reached her full potential, and lack of output made really immersing myself into her music kind of difficult. So going into SOS, I was reasonably worried. The album is 23 songs, and in the past, I've struggled to connect with SZA over only 14. And for all the vocal growth SZA has done in the past few years, I think it still shows sometimes that she's not really a trained singer. Specifically, I've noticed that she always stays in roughly the same exact vocal range, which can make performances blend together and feel a bit less personal. What I wanted going into this record was an album that embraced everything I already knew SZA was great at: constructing unique sonic landscapes, creating an elegant atmosphere, and embracing her personality, not being afraid to tinge her music with something distinctly SZA. That last one was pretty important to me, since after years in the R&B scene, I don't know if SZA has really carved out a specific niche for herself, a particularly SZA sound. It's an issue that is definitely not unique to her, and for what it's worth, there are plenty of other R&B artists who I think are much worse about this. Controversially, I would say Summer Walker, but it's still an issue I have with a lot of SZA's music. While Control laid down this retro, spacey groundwork, that foundation has never really been built upon, especially with the singles for SOS, which were all extremely different from one another and from Control. But I can happily say that SOS is a great album, a multi-layered exploration of love, heartbreak, and personal growth filtered through a sonic palette that is diverse, but still manages to create a pretty cohesive aesthetic. Most of all, I'm obsessed with the actual music here. I think some of these tracks are made by their beats alone and barely need SZA to complete them, even though her inclusion is always much appreciated. I'll start at the start and say that the title track is a beautiful, vibrant piece of early 2000s chipmunk soul that perfectly introduces the record and SZA's determined energy, feeling like a proper opener to the project as a whole. Fittingly, SZA draws upon the same musical backdrop for Smokin' on My X-Pac, the 11th song of the album, and one that feels very much like a reset after the emotional climax of Gone Girl. And I mean, Gone Girl. This song is another masterclass of production, featuring these heavenly choir vocals and eventually shifting into an explosive outro. The outro here is especially important to mention when comparing this record to Control, because it represents this refusal on the part of SZA to fall into musical monotony. For as much as I love Control songs like Love Galore and The Weeknd, those tracks really don't progress towards anything. I mean, that's fine, of course. Some songs function best as long, relaxed experiences, but in the context of SZA's music, that lack of progression has often been an obstacle for me. For someone who already stays in roughly the same vocal lane, it can get a bit dull when tracks are going on for over 4 minutes and not really building into something more. On SOS, however, SZA seems acutely aware of that fact, and when she does stretch a song out past the 3-minute mark, there's always a visible reason for it. Again, Gone Girl has this immaculate outro, and Good Days rides out for nearly 2 minutes and incorporates some beat variations plus backing vocals from Jacob Collier to spice everything up. My favorite example of this forward progression, though, is easily on Ghost in the Machine, probably my favorite song from this whole album, which begins with quiet acoustic plucking and then slowly develops into this heavier electronic sound that becomes overpowering before Phoebe Bridgers strips the track back down into sparse piano and then is subsequently drowned out herself by the return of that synthetic production, this time all the heavier and more robotic. Not only is the progression here storied and complex, it tells its own narrative, one that fits perfectly with the song itself, which sees SZA and Phoebe yearning for humanity in a world of the artificial. And outside of Chipmunk Soul and beautiful song progressions, SZA makes a bunch of extremely interesting sonic choices here. The slow Tarantino-flared instrumentation of Kill Bill, the psychedelic trap of Low, the relaxed vibe of Love Language, the anthemic pop-punk of F2F, the country flair of Nobody Gets Me, the bouncy energy of Conceited, the retro electronica of I Hate You, the classic boom bap of Forgiveless. I mean, I could go on and on. There's very few tracks here which feel even remotely uninspired, and I think that every song works perfectly to complement SZA's personality and vocals. Speaking of those vocals, we obviously need to talk about the performance of the woman herself, SZA. I've already mentioned how SZA often stays in the same vocal range, and that's not really something I think has changed here, but I will say SZA seems to have honed and gotten much more comfortable with her singing voice on this album. She's able to add specific flares when needed, especially on songs like Notice Me and Conceited, where she matches the fun energy of the instrumentals perfectly, and a lot of the time, SZA's particular voice works to her benefit. I already praised Ghost in the Machine, but I'll mention it again just to say that SZA's very distinct, unchanging vocal style complements the song's whole theme of artificiality, and I think the choice to pair with another singer who stays in basically the same vocal range all the time, Phoebe Bridgers, was a great call for this track. Both singers carry a lot of emotion without having to do much vocal performance, perfect for the ideas at hand. Also, we need more rapping performances from SZA. Every time she branches into rapping or just rides more hip-hop style production on SOS, it's absolute fireworks. The closer in particular is a clear highlight of SZA's rapping ability. Featuring the late Old Dirty Bastard, who SZA somehow matches perfectly, the song is empowered and headstrong, tying everything back to the opener and concluding on a powerful note as an impassioned SZA affirms that she doesn't really need to care about the opinions or limitations of others, specifically ex-partners. There's also something really interesting happening here with the performances of SZA's features themselves. While the majority of SOS's features, from the computerized trap of Travis Scott and Don Toliver to the reserved folk of Phoebe Bridgers, have been very toned down and even robotic, ODB is the exact opposite of that, dynamic and undefinable at every turn. And since the final track represents SZA finally breaking away from a very artificial world of self-doubt and internal pain, ODB is a perfect fit. That's just something that I picked up on that I thought was interesting. Ultimately though, Forgiveless is a very important note to end on thematically, and I think this offers us a great means of transition into the actual writing here, which I think is generally the best of SZA's entire career thus far. In the bigger picture, this album seeks to process a breakup, pretty standard fare for an R&B record. But what makes SOS special is how the project intertwines classic breakup motifs with a multitude of other topics: isolation, self-confidence, feminism, race, mental health. After a particularly bad breakup and a particularly bad past few years, SZA is at an all-time low, deprived of her self-worth and chaotically trying to regain her strength. Consistently, it feels like SZA is performing a balancing act here between what Pitchfork described in their review of SOS as the bad bitch and sad girl sides of herself. There is a woman within SZA who is strong, uncompromising, and brave, yet there's also a side of SZA that is vulnerable, unsure of herself and of her future as a whole. While tracks here move across the spectrum, each song can basically be slotted into either of those personas. The truth is, of course, that SZA can be both. She doesn't need to tear herself apart, constantly flipping between the two. SZA can be strong and vulnerable. Desiring someone doesn't need to come at the cost of self-worth, and strength doesn't mean love is entirely out of the question. But SZA struggles to recognize this for much of the record. On Blind in particular, she laments how she's unable to see the love inside of herself, the complete person within. For some, this might seem hard to believe, the idea that a breakup would drive SZA into a state of such disarray, but again, it's important to remember that the breakup is compounding so many other things in SZA's life. She connects the feelings of being manipulated by her partner to a history of racial discrimination on used, with lines about SZA being used all her life and having to give out flowers to the mothers of her dead friends. Body image plays a major role on Special, where SZA grapples with how much she's had to change herself to become more desirable for her ex, specifically in regard to plastic surgery. The track explores body dysmorphia in a complex, interesting way and plays on this common idea that we as women can just be used up, that one day we will lose our value, lose what made us special in the first place. Obviously, this alludes to the feminist leanings of SOS, reflected in a variety of songs here, but most clearly in Gone Girl, which references the book and film of the same name to couch SZA's abandonment of her partner in the context of patriarchal oppression. And Good Days, another contender for my absolute favorite song on SOS, explicitly plays on ideas of mental well-being, with SZA crafting these beautiful safe spaces in her mind, yet having them constantly invaded by the memory and presence of her ex. She reflects here on trying not to lose herself under the weight of her past partner, saying she's on her empty mind shit, clearing out negative and toxic influences on her mental before everything comes crashing down. So the breakup acts as the catalyst for a lot of shit, as most breakups do. It exacerbates tensions already present in SZA's life and puts things in stark perspective for our protagonist, resulting in a chaotic, uncertain fight for fulfillment. And this is why it always upsets me when I hear people describe SOS as just another breakup album, because it is truly so much more than that. And on the subject of things being more than just the sum of their parts, I guess the last question I really want to address here is, does SZA define a unique style for herself on SOS? Do the individual tracks here come to form a more cohesive, complete sound? It seems like a simple question, but I promise you, it's actually kind of hard to answer. So SOS is a cry for help, an album about SZA and her fractured mental state. We've already explored that, but the main way in which that fractured reality manifests on the project is in songs that are radically different from one another. The album rarely ever becomes predictable. The second you think you have it figured out, the record breaks into mid-2000s pop rock or Taylor Swift style country music, and while that variety is great, it doesn't really help SZA, who, in my opinion, has historically struggled to find a particular sound for herself. Now, there are consistent identifying aesthetics running throughout this project. Specifically, a lot of the tracks here have this general, soft, earthy feel to them, which has been a staple of SZA's career thus far, but I still don't think this record is some breakthrough for SZA's sound or anything. Every song fits on the album though, which is a definite positive and speaks to a certain level of cohesiveness achieved by SZA here. Also, I can't really fault her for not defining a stronger aesthetic, because doing that on an album where the entire point is to have tracks that are completely different from one another is extremely difficult. The only real recent example of that happening that I can think of is the most recent Kendrick Lamar album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. But that's a record from probably our greatest living musician, and he's been making music for a hell of a lot longer than SZA. So does SZA define a distinct sound for herself here? Yes and no. She creates a nice atmosphere that allows all the songs to work together, but her focus on variety really prevents any particular sound from rising to the top, which I would say is totally fine in the context of SOS. Even if, in future releases, I would really love to see SZA carve out a more particular, specific sound for herself. That's just me though. SOS is amazing. I really enjoyed it on first listen, and I can't stop coming back to it. I think in a musical environment where I'm so often having to do a lot of personal work and thinking to figure out why albums are so good, SOS stands out as a record that's just plain good. It's not good because of some deep conceptual theme. It's not good because of some experimental soundscape. It's not good with X, Y, and Z qualifiers. It's just clearly, obviously, good. I don't think it really asks much of its audience, but the emotions and presentation of the album still deliver such a strong impact that it's able to stick with listeners in the long term. I'll just compare it to probably my favorite album of all time, another R&B masterpiece, Frank Ocean's Blonde. I have done a lot of writing on Blonde, probably too much, and I've analyzed and broken down basically every song on the album, but I still remember my first time hearing the record, how visceral and powerful the album was on its surface alone. I live in Atlanta. I wouldn't say SOS is Blonde level, but it functions in a very similar way to Blonde. There is stuff to sink your teeth into on SOS. I've done a lot of that in this video, but it doesn't require you to do that extra work. If you would rather sit back and just experience the material here, I think you'll probably get the same level of enjoyment out of this album. And there's a real skill involved in making that happen. SOS is a really special release. It has me excited for whatever comes next from SZA. It has me very ready to admit that she's one of the best R&B artists working today, and it just makes me happy. I've really enjoyed listening to this album, so, thank you, SZA. But as always, I have been Ellie. You guys have been wonderful, and please let me know your thoughts on this new SZA album in the comments below. I had a great time listening to the album. I'm still really processing and enjoying it, but I would love to hear you guys' opinions. Always appreciate, a secondary perspective, so please feel free to let me know below. Until next time, that's the video. Bye!